Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Booker, and today I'm looking forward a little bit to June. This is not June at the time of recording, it's almost June, but it will be when this video goes out, and it is therefore Pride Month. And this is a really, great time of the year anyway, just the way that this point of the year really celebrates queer voices, LGBTQ voices, and in recent years has been doing sort of even better to really spotlight people within the community whose voices aren't often amplified that much, such as, for example, trans people or people of colour within the LGBTQ spectrum. So with that in mind, I wanted to look forward to some books that I'm really looking forward to during Pride Month, either that I already own that I plan to read, or that are new coming out. And I'm really excited just at the idea of some of these coming out and actually finally having a chance to finally read some of these. A lot of these are books that I own and have been meaning to read for the longest time and keep on ignoring. And in my April wrap-up video, I was like, yes, May, I've got all these other books that I'm going to read. I'm going to read for pleasure. It's going to be so great. And then I basically just read library books that are Booker Prize shortlisted books and completely broke my own rule on that. It might not change that much this coming month because I think I've got a lot of library books I need to go back. But I'm going to try and intersperse it with some of these. And you may notice a lot of these are quite short for that reason. But yeah, these are books by LGBTQ writers and or dealing with LGBTQ themes, and I'm just really excited to get around to them. So firstly, one I've not got a physical copy of but finished recently is What It Feels Like for a Girl by Paris Lees. This is a sort of fictionalized memoir is kind of not it. I think I've had a few interviews with Paris Lees recently, and she's spoken really beautifully about this book. So she is a trans woman, a writer, an activist. She does really interesting, exciting things. Actually, I think in those interviews she said that she doesn't feel like she is an activist, but she does incredible stuff nonetheless. And What It Feels Like for a Girl is her kind of growing up story, essentially. So her growing up in Hucknall in Nottingham, which is kind of great because the whole book is written in the kind of local dialect accent, and so Hucknall is always Ucknall, and loads of other bits like that. And it's interesting because at first it's quite overwhelming, the whole book being written in kind of dialect. But it's really quite fascinating because it adds to the character of the book, and we get this real sense all the way through of Paris Lees growing up in a time that wasn't particularly friendly for LGBTQ people, at a time where she thought she was a gay man, and later came to sort of find that she was trans, and kind of going through being that kid either way in both of those was really quite fascinating. So she is an interesting person regardless, and this book does some really fascinating fun things with her growing up, and I just think it's really worth checking out. So I'm really glad I read it as an advance copy from NetGalley, and yeah, really interesting. Next is so last year I really loved this book Box Hill by Adam Mars Jones, and this is all sort of about a biker sort of sub-dom relationship with a sort of biker gang kind of in the background. It's really short and really interesting, and it does some really fun, fascinating stuff. Anyway, in June, Adam Mars Jones has a new book coming out called Batlava Lake, which I'm really fascinated to check out because I have really enjoyed what I have read of his, which is admittedly not very much, but he's a really interesting writer and does some gorgeous things. So yeah. Now onto some books that I have been basically neglecting for a very long time, which is, and again, most of these you'll notice are very short. So first is Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again by Katharine Angel, which is a short essay about women and desire in the age of consent. So not explicitly queer, but I think does go into some really interesting things around sex and sexuality. I remember seeing this in a bookshop and just thinking this sounded fascinating, so I picked it up. actually have got a signed copy, interestingly, which is completely accidental. But I'm really excited to check out a little bit more of this book, just with how it talks about consent and desire and so many other topics. Next is a fiction book called All Men Want to Know by Nina Bouraoui. And this is all about a woman and her sort of childhood in Algeria, and then her sort of moving to Paris and sort of finding out her kind of sexuality and her kind of queerness within that. And I ended up with 2 copies of this completely by accident, because I bought this in a bookshop just thinking it sounded fascinating, completely didn't get round to reading it, and then a subscription I have with Queer Book Box also sent it, and I was like, okay, fine, I'll read it. So I'm finally going to try and get round to it this month, and it's quite a short book again, so I'm really excited to check this out. Next is another one from the Queer Book Box, or rather another 3, because I keep on, basically I think I've had a subscription with them for about 1.5 years and then have been terrible at actually getting around to reading them, but they are very pretty and exciting books. So the next is a set of essays and sort of personal stories called the Bible New Testimonials, and this is narratives and essays around bisexuality. And from what I can see, does quite an interesting thing of a really broad spectrum of bi identity. So really thinking about bi voices that often get left out of LGBTQ discussions and dialogue and things like that. So really excited to check this beautiful little book out as well. Similarly, there is a set of short stories by Jess, Arndt, called Large Animals, and this really delves into ideas around bodies, around gender, and sexuality, and I'm just really keen to check this out. It's by Cypher Press, who are a really exciting small press, and they put out really interesting books from what I've seen. I think this will be the first of theirs that I've read, but they always sound absolutely fascinating. I think 100 Boyfriends was a book that they released recently that sounded incredible, that I've been meaning to check out. But yes, that's Large Animals by them. And finally, as well from that, I think I've managed to get rid of the baked bean stain on the cover of this. I accidentally dropped it into my lunch earlier. And this is How to Be Autistic by Charlotte Amelia Poe. And this is a sort of set of personal essays of this young woman, of Charlotte Amelia Poe, talking about her autism, talking about her gender, talking about her sexuality, and how she sort of navigates all 3 of them, how they all kind of intersect in various interesting ways. So I'm really excited to check this out. I've been neglecting to read anything that they've sent recently, but this is the most recent they've sent, and it's a really great little subscription service. It's really interesting because there are in a few books that they've sent that have been kind of better known. So Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez, Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez, which is somewhere down here, and I've been meaning to read that for the longest time as well, which they also sent. Yeah, they do a really interesting job of finding queer voices that are the less sort of seen ones. So often writers of colour, trans or non-binary writers, often women, often often queer people with disabilities. Really broad range of writing, and so interesting to see. And it's great to see that they've really gone out and thought about a much broader sense of what queer writing is, especially right at the moment, than just, you know, what is often the case, which is cisgendered white gay men. And although I'm part of that group, it you know, sort of it should be said that, you know, there's obviously such a broad range of writing out there, and it's really great to introduce people to all of those. And anyway, before I ramble on a bit more about that, there is also a book by an author who probably needs no introduction to many people, who is Ali Smith, with Girl Meets Boy. I've had this on my shelf for the longest time, and I think I bought it. I mean, it says it's from City of York Libraries, so I don't think I stole it. I think it was genuinely just sort of being sold, you know, from a library. You know, they're kind of getting rid of a few old books, but this is it's one of her earlier books, I think, and especially as I'm hoping to do a big wrap up of all of Ali Smith's books in August to kind of coincide with her birthday. I thought I'd go back and actually read some of the ones of hers I've not read yet. I think I've I think I've got about 4 books of hers I've not read, this being one of them. So I'm going to try and check that out this month, as it has a kind of fluidity around gender and sexuality, which Ali Smith does quite playfully and joyfully anyway, but I'm really excited to check out a bit more of. Now, as I'm going through this list, many of you may think, this is probably more than a month's reading. You're probably right, given that I'm also going to be doing a lot of book reading alongside this. But this is aspirational. This is me hoping to read these. I'm a fairly quick reader, probably won't get through all of these. There's also Mainstream, which is an anthology of stories from the edges. So this is often people who are sort of marginalised in society in various ways. So these may be writers of colour, these may be queer writers, disabled writers, working class writers, a combination of all of the above. Yeah, really interesting. So I'm excited to check this out. Especially, so I remember I thought this was a really interesting idea for a collection, tried submitting a short story to it, didn't get accepted, but I'm not bitter, I'm fine. I'm fine. No, honestly, I mean, it looks like such a really interesting set of writers, and, you know, some really big, like a few bigger names in here. So Juliette Jacques, you've got, where is it, Kit Duval, yeah, a few writers who I've sort of heard of before. I'm really excited to check out a bit more of their work and kind of a set of short stories or short pieces. Yeah. I mentioned this in an LGBTQ history month video, but I'm going to try and actually get around to reading this book this month, at least kind of starting on it, because it's something I could break down into small chapters and read here and there. And that's The Pink Line, The World's Queer Frontiers by Mark Gevisser, which basically is a big look at kind of queer history, and particularly looking at kind of modern queer histories and kind of rights, but particularly in countries that we don't often hear about as much, because often, you know, a lot of our discussion of queer rights across the world is either focused on North America and Europe and, you know, Australia and New Zealand, and kind of saying like, yay, we, you know, marriage was just voted through, or it's kind of talking about the death penalty elsewhere. And there doesn't really seem to be a middle point where we talk about activism in other countries. We almost kind of talk about it as if there's an enlightened West and kind of in the Dark Ages non-West, and that's really damaging as a narrative. And I think from what I've heard about this book so far, does quite an interesting thing of delving into kind of what things look like in various other places. So, but you know, a few, I think Kenya is in here, I think Israel, Palestine, both in here as well. So really interesting stuff. And speaking of Palestine, dropping books everywhere, there is also Love is an ExCountry by Randa, Jarrar. And this is a memoir, and this is, on the back, she describes herself as queer, Muslim, Arab American, a proudly fat woman. And so it's basically a bit of a road trip of her going through. And I'm really excited to check this out, to kind of hear her voice as somebody who fits, you know, is sort of has many identities that I am not part of. I think this is really exciting to learn about, particularly at the moment with, you know, a lot of the discussions around Palestine, and about conflict and about occupation. Really interesting, because often the case that's made by a lot of people is, yeah, but you know, you'd rather be queer in Israel than you would in Palestine. And this book I'm really excited to read about in terms of a Palestinian woman talking about her queerness. And I think that's something really interesting. So really excited to check this out. Yeah, it looks like quite a fun one. And that takes me just to my final two, which I realise this looks like a lot of new books, many of them from subscription services or just that I've had for a little bit. And also just some because I got a bit trigger happy with bookshop.org. But these last two I bought with a birthday voucher that I got from my local bookshop. And the first is The Secret to Superhuman Strength by Alison Bechdel. I've spoken about her a lot on my channel before, but Fun Home and Are You My Mother, but particularly Fun Home, I just thought was stunning. This book is all about her relationship to exercise, and from what I've seen so far, sort of charts her relationship with her body, with exercise, with sort of other parts of her identity throughout her time and her time on Earth, and kind of her life. So really excited to read a bit more about this, because we don't necessarily get a sense of that as much in Fun Home. I think she occasionally talks about going for walks or runs, but yeah, excited to see how it kind of comes together. And Alison Bechdel, even I feel like a bad Alison Bechdel, is still incredible. So I know that I'm going to be I'm going to really enjoy this. Yeah, excited to check this out. And finally, this takes me on to Olivia Laing with Everybody, which is a book about freedom. And this is also signed, which is fun. Again, just purely by accident because I was just picking it up from my local bookshop. And Olivia Laing, I believe now uses they, them pronouns. And I really enjoyed their book, Crudo, which is just this really sort of short novella almost, that's just very funny, a bit experimental, a bit silly, but just really interesting kind of post-Brexit Britain kind of vibe, which can be difficult territory. But I heard Olivia Laing talking about this on a podcast and just thought they were so interesting in how they spoke about this book. This book sort of ostensibly, I mean, it kind of goes on a lot of other things, but this is sort of her charting. Oh yeah, here we go. Olivia Laing conducts an ambitious investigation into the body and its discontents, using the life of the renegade psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich to chart a daring course through the long struggle for bodily freedom, from gay rights and sexual liberation to feminism and the civil rights movement. So, really interesting way of approaching history and approaching sort of things, of kind of focusing on one area in the sense of bodies and how we approach our bodies and going through there. And it was also a really nice bit of serendipity because she talks here about, here we go, I'll find this book. She talks about Wilhelm Reich, and I hadn't made the connection, but she started talking about it in this interview. They started talking about it in this interview, and they mentioned this book here, which I'm reading at the moment, going to be reading for a Kate Bush video, and that is A Book of Dreams, which is Wilhelm Reich's son, Peter Reich, who basically, Wilhelm Reich was this kind of figure who had these sort of really grand beliefs about the body and about the world and various other things, and wanted to create a machine that would make clouds, and kind of had these other sort of theories. So he sort of legitimately was sort of seen as a threat by the government and by the CIA. And so A Book of Dreams, which I really need to get around to soon, by Peter Reich, is his son talking about what it was like growing up with a man who was essentially this sort of dreamer, fantasist kind of character, but who was also seen as a threat to the government. And yeah, so really, really excited. But anyway, Olivia Laing in their book also talks about him. So I'm really excited to kind of read these two sort of side by side and see how that goes, to kind of have such a polarizing figure as someone like Wilhelm Reich. And then this sort of beautiful bit where I'll read all about his son, and then how that inspired the song Cloud Busting by Kate Bush, which is a great song, and will feature prominently, or I will talk about it prominently in a Kate Bush video that is coming up in a few weeks. Anyway, all of that aside, these are books that I'm really excited about for Pride Month. As probably, as you may be able to tell, probably will not get through all of these, but you know, the optimism and the ambition is there. But regardless, please do let me know books that you're excited to read that are coming up during Pride Month, either that are newly being released, or that you've had for a while and you've been meaning to get around to. I'm always up for more recommendations, even if my TBR is a bit of a joke at the moment. Anyway, lovely chatting to you. My desk now looks like an absolute tip because I've just put these books everywhere. I've been Bob, and enjoy your reading and have a wonderful and fantastic Pride Month. Take care. Bye bye.